is simply truth. Well, that makes sense. That's going to be anathema. That's going to be not in keeping with the Catholic Church, not in keeping with traditional ideas of God. So what Descartes is doing is he is in some sense revising what we mean by God, or what he means by God, and what we can talk about when we talk about the idea of God. And I've said this before, that Descartes is very similar to Augustine. And Augustine, one of the most influential church fathers, says things that are pretty similar to this, right? I mean, how do we know God's existence? We know God's existence because there are eternal absolute truths, and those are evidenced most in mathematics and in natural science, and in nature. So Descartes is returning us to this idea and sort of adapting this idea to a more scientific historical period. God is nature, God is mathematics, and kind of trying to unify the idea of God with the idea of science. Anyway, so that's Descartes' idea of God, that God is truth. And so one of the difficulties, one of the things that Descartes is struggling with is, how do I know that I'm not God, right? And he says, well, I can't be God because I'm full of flaws, I'm deceived, and there's so much that I don't know and understand, so how could I be God? If I were God, it would be ridiculous for me to be ignorant of things or go wrong. How would a perfect being go wrong, right? We talked about this scenario where, it's conceivable that I would be making myself hallucinate things that don't really exist, and therefore deceiving myself. Descartes thinks that, or concludes that is not really an option. Why? Because God is truth. God is found in truth, and the only evidence of God is in truth. God is perfection. To think of God as being anything other than truth and perfection is to miss the point. Why would we attribute anything to God but truth and perfection, based on the evidence that we have, right? Which is the cogito, this perfect truth. And so Descartes extrapolates from this, right? If God is truth, then God must not be a deceiver. God cannot be a deceiver. God only ever tells the truth. All truth comes from God, and everything of God is truth. And then the question is, well, why then am I so constantly deceived, and why do I make so many mistakes? And this is the beginning of the fourth meditation, which I mentioned in the last lecture, where Descartes says that I am something of an intermediary. I am a thing that is between God and nothingness, right? Insofar as I have access to and know the truth, then I am in God. I am part of God. And insofar as I am mistaken or I go astray, then I am nothingness. I participate in nothingness. And so we hear, again, I think I mentioned this also last time, that we hear a kind of reverberation of Plotinus here also, right? Everything that is truly, and everything that is therefore belongs to and is part of God. And everything that is deceptive or is a mistake, everything that is less than perfect is nothingness, is absence. Right? So here Descartes is saying, when I am mistaken, when I do wrong, it's not the work of some evil deceiver. It's not the work of some positive force of evil. It is merely the absence of God. It is a lack. So I am this thing that is between God and nothingness. So this is also a question that we recall from Plotinus, and the question is, how do I, as it were, maximize the part of myself that is with God and avoid participating in the part of myself that is nothingness? Let's check my notes here. And he says, this is a question of the will, again. And Descartes says, how is it that I am like God? And he's thinking here biblically. I think he's thinking about this idea that the human is made in the image of God. Right? That man is made in the image of God. Well, how so? In what sense? What in me is like God? I'm limited in so many ways, right? So far from being omnipotent and omniscient and eternal. Right? There are so many things I can't do, can't know, and I'm limited. I have finite existence. Right? My life is finite. So, where in all of this do I find anything? Where in myself do I find anything that resembles an infinite and all-powerful being, an all-knowing being? And Descartes says it is in our will. He says our will is like God's will. Our will is infinite. And this is kind of a nice answer. Right? There is no limit to what we can will for ourselves. Right? I can will myself to fly. I can will myself to cure cancer. I can will myself to live forever. What I'm able to will, and by will, he means not just the force of volition, right? The ability to do something, to force yourself to do something, but also a wish and a desire and a want, right? What we will for ourselves, what we want for ourselves. That's unlimited. It is infinite and eternal. So we are like God in that God's will is infinite and our will is infinite also. Now, the question then is, how do we use this will? What is the proper use of the will? And Descartes doesn't give us really any kind of ethics in these meditations. The meditations are about metaphysics, they're about existence, my existence, the existence of God, the existence of the external world, and so on. But if there's one thing that comes close to an ethics in Descartes' Meditations, it's in this question of how I ought to use my will. And he says, my will greatly outpaces my ability. I am a limited being with an unlimited will. And so how I ought to be, the way that I can bring myself closest to God, to be in the truth as much as possible, right? Because remember, this is also a project about discovering certainty within the natural sciences, certainty in philosophy and knowledge. How can I be certain? How can I have knowledge? So how can I keep myself in truth? How can I keep myself in, as he says, the natural light? He says we need to limit our will to correspond to our abilities. And most specifically, he says, what we need to do to stay in the truth, to stay in real being and to avoid deception, is to use my will to only assent to truths that I perceive clearly and distinctly, and to withhold judgment wherever I do not have clear and distinct understanding. Right, so I should only ever assent to something, agree that something is true, when I understand it clearly and distinctly, when I have certain knowledge of it, the kind of knowledge that I have in mathematics or in questions of pure logic. So, how many times a day or a week or in life do we sort of make guesses, right? Or say, yeah, that's probably true, or agree to things that we don't know are certainly true. For Descartes, that is a misuse of our will. That is our participating in non-being. And in a sense, that is us abdicating our very being. It's only when we have clear and distinct knowledge and affirm that knowledge, assent to that. I'm trying to think of a good example off the top of my head. Sorry, my brain is really sort of scrambled right now. But right, in the proper use of the will, that's the key. Don't agree to things unless you know them to be true for certain. And we can see how this fits into the whole question of the sciences, right? Scientific method. You don't say something is true based on a hunch or based on anything less than obvious and overwhelming evidence. So sort of the criteria for what counts as true. We need to have clarity and distinctness. Now, having said, right, what it is that we can have, well, having said what he means by God, right, nature, subject matter of pure mathematics, we can have a sense of what he thinks we can assent to, right? the only thing that I should assent to, agree to, the only things that I should base my will on are those things that we know scientifically and mathematically. And so, interestingly, this means that what we've come to think of as the realm of appearances, the physical world, all of that is, in one sense, understandable through science and mathematics. And on the other hand, it is not. And so we think again about the example of the wax. The physical properties of the wax, the atomic structure that underlies the wax, that Descartes thinks we can have clear and distinct knowledge about. And I can freely assent to ideas about the wax insofar as it is a scientific object, mathematically understood. With respect to the wax as an appearance, solid or liquid, that we don't really have knowledge about. I can't say for certain that the wax is solid or liquid. Those are appearances. They are not as real as the scientific description of the wax. So for Descartes, and this is, I think if I were to say what Descartes means for philosophy and for the world, what Descartes' true legacy is, it is in reducing the world to a scientific object. All knowledge requires certainty. And any kind of knowledge that doesn't have some kind of, or rather that kind of certainty, mathematical, scientific certainty, is nonsense, meaningless, a misuse of the will, right? We shouldn't expect to be able to have certain knowledge about, for example, good and evil, ethics, morality, politics, aesthetics, how to behave. All of those things are mere opinion. We can't have certain knowledge of them. They are what now we call humanities, soft sciences. It's not true knowledge. And in that sense, it isn't really real for Descartes. Sounds a little like Plotinus also, right? But with Descartes, the whole world becomes interesting, true, and real only through scientific investigation. People sometimes talk about the disenchantment of the world that begins in the modern period, with the beginning of modernity. And this is what they're getting at, what that idea means, that everything becomes an object. Everything becomes objectified. And we need to have that objective knowledge accurate mathematical, scientific representation of all things. And anything that can't be grasped through that mathematical, scientific representation, can't be grasped objectively, is not real knowledge, doesn't count. So there's a lot of philosophy after Descartes, and in particular in the 19th and 20th century, a lot of critique of this. But the idea that the world is purely material and can be unlocked through scientific investigation, that's a Cartesian idea. So, yeah, the objectification of the world. And this is going to then give Descartes criteria for understanding the rest of the external world also, right? He's going to be able to prove that things exist outside of himself because God is not a deceiver, and those external things can be grasped scientifically and mathematically. And as long as we're able to discern scientific and mathematical properties in objects external to us, we can be sure of their existence because God is not a deceiver. Yeah. All right, guys. I think we're gonna leave it at that. I'm very sorry. I love Descartes. I think that Descartes is really interesting. I wish I could. Everything is so discombobulated. I'm doing my best to keep up with you guys. But I've got my Leibniz. We're going to go through that in some greater detail. Yeah. Okay. So I'm not going to be holding office hours until after Easter break, but we'll get back to the office hours after that also. And I will try to go through my email also to see if you guys have any questions. Yeah, all right. I'm back. We're focusing on it. I'm going to start having this together a little bit more. I promise. Thank you for bearing with me. I'm sorry. It's been a tough week, but we're all gonna get through it. Okay. Next video will be out when I get through this first bit of Leibniz. I will try and put up some questions on Blackboard about Descartes and maybe try and supplement this lecture with some writing. I think it may be easier to write some of this out than try and do it off the top of my head this way. All right, guys. Thank you. Bye.